She survived the beatings. She survived the cellar, the hunger, the bruises her stepmother pressed into her skin like a signature, the particular mark of a woman who needed Elara to carry her cruelty visibly, internally, permanently, so that the weight of it would keep her too close to the ground to ever look up and see what was above her. She survived the staircase. She survived the will reading. Standing broken at the bottom of the stairs, she had just been thrown down, her arm bound against her chest, her mother's words still ringing in the hollow spaces Viven had carved into her across 21 years of systematic erasure. And she had watched Arthur Greywell break a seal that had been waiting longer than she had been alive. $900 billion. Her mother's dynasty, her birthright. Hers, or so she believed, because Part 1 gave her the will, and the will gave her the legal claim. And the legal claim felt in that entrance hall with the afternoon light coming through. The tall windows and Viven stripped of her performance for the first time, like the ending of something. It was not the ending of anything. It was the door. Part 2 showed her what was behind it. 3 sealed folders, red wax, black wax, midnight blue, and inside them a truth so layered, so deliberately buried, so architecturally constructed over decades by people with institutional power and occult connections, and the particular patience of those who have never once been held accountable for anything, that by the time the last folder was open, Elara understood something that the will reading had not prepared her for. Viven had never been the architect. Viven had always been the instrument. The architect was above the governor, above the network, above the registry with its eye inside a geometric shape symbol carved into cellar doors and stamped beside powerful names. The architect was someone whose identity Arthur had been protecting, not to deceive Elara, but because the name, delivered before she was ready, would have destroyed rather than armed her. And then Arthur was gone. A headline, a staircase, declared dead at scene, and the note under the door, and the name on the back of the photograph, and the real briefcase waiting in a location only Elara knew. She had the name of her biological father. She had Arthur's instructions. She had Grace beside her and Clara's letter in her hands, and 21 years of compressed fury that had finally, irrevocably, been given a direction. What she did not have, what Part 2 ended before it could give her, was time. Because while Elara sat on the marble floor of the entrance hall reading her mother's handwriting for the first time, something was already moving toward her. Not Viven, not the governor, something older. Something that had been watching this story from above its entire architecture since before Elara was born. Something that had decided, at the precise moment Elara read the name on the back of the photograph, that the period of observation was over, and that what came next was not surveillance, it was elimination. Part 3 is not the continuation of the fight. Part 3 is the moment Elara discovers that everything she has survived up until now was the prologue, and the people who wrote it are still at their desks, still writing, and they have just turned to her page. The envelope had been slid under the front door with the quiet precision of someone who had already gone by the time it arrived. Elara sat on the marble floor of the Voss estate entrance hall, her mother's letter in her lap, the broken wax seals of all 3 folders scattered across the mahogany table above her, the cold noon light falling through the tall windows with the indifferent brightness of a world that had not paused for any of the morning's revelations. And she held Arthur's note card in both hands and read it for the 4th time. Not because she had failed to understand it, because she needed the weight of his handwriting to be real in her hands before she moved, because Arthur Greywell was dead according to every official channel that existed, and the note card was the only thing in the world at this specific moment that told her otherwise, and she was not yet willing to set it down. I am not where they think I am. The body they found was not mine. The real briefcase is where I told you. Go there. Go alone. Go now. What is inside it will give you his address. His address. Her father's address. The name she had read on the back of Clara's photograph was still moving through her. Not like information, not like a fact to be filed and processed, but like something seismic. Like something that had been true her entire life and had simply been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for the moment she was ready to know it. She had not spoken the name aloud yet. She was not sure she was ready to. There was a specific power in unspoken things. She had learned this from Viven, who had weaponized silence her entire childhood, but the lesson itself was separable from its teacher. An unspoken name was still entirely hers. The moment she said it out loud, it would belong to the air, to the room, to the people in it, to whatever forces were already moving toward her from the direction she could not yet see. She kept it inside for a little longer. Miss Voss. Grace was in the kitchen corridor doorway, had been there, Elara realized, for several minutes, maintaining the quiet peripheral presence of someone who understood that the person in the center of the room needed to arrive at readiness in their own time. She was holding a glass of water in both hands, with the practical care of someone who could not fix what was broken, but could address what was immediate. Elara looked up.
You need to drink something.
You need to drink something, Grace said.
Because the next thing they
and then you need to move.
The
because whoever sent those cars to the gate this morning will send something else this afternoon. And the next thing they send will not stop at the gate. Elara took the water, drank it completely, set the glass on the marble floor beside her, with the deliberate precision of a woman organizing the small things, because the large things required every other resource she possessed. Then she stood up. The hunch was gone. She had not decided to remove it. It had simply not followed her up from the floor, as if the marble had kept it when she rose, as if the weight of Clara's letter, of the name on the photograph, of Arthur's handwriting still warm in her hand, had redistributed something in the architecture of her spine that Viven had spent 2 decades compressing. She was standing at her full height for what felt, in her body's memory, like the first time. The location Arthur told me, she said to Grace, is 40 minutes from here. I need to go alone. Grace nodded, not the nod of someone agreeing, but the nod of someone who had anticipated this and had already prepared the response. The estate's secondary vehicle is in the west garage, Grace said. It is not registered to the Voss accounts. It was maintained separately, under a different name, for the past 3 years. Elara looked at her. Arthur, Grace said simply. Of course, 20 years of preparation. A dead man who had spent 2 decades ensuring that the person he was protecting would have what she needed in the exact moment she needed it, down to an unregistered vehicle in a garage that Viven had never thought to look inside because it appeared, in the estate's official records, not to exist. There is one more thing, Grace said. She reached into the pocket of her staff uniform and produced a phone, not Elara's, not Arthur's, a third device, sealed in a plain envelope with Elara's name in the same handwriting as the note card. He said to turn it on only when you are inside the vehicle with the doors locked, not before. Elara took it. She picked up Clara's letter, folded it along its original creases with the care of someone returning something sacred to its housing, placed it inside her jacket, against her chest, over her heart, the same place her mother had intended it. She picked up the photograph, did not fold it this time, held it face up, Clara's face, luminous and warm, looking up at her in the noon light, then turned it over, read the name one more time, said it, quietly, for the first time, to no one but herself, and the entrance hall that had been the site of so much of her suffering, and was now, whether it deserved to be or not, the site of her beginning. Then she walked toward the west garage. Behind her, Grace moved to the window to watch the iron gates at the end of the drive, because someone needed to be watching the gates. And the gates, as Grace had predicted, were already showing the first sign of what was coming next. A third vehicle had joined the two that had been there since morning. This one had no plates. The third vehicle with no plates had not moved by the time Elara pulled the secondary car out of the west garage and took the service road that ran along the estate's eastern perimeter, a road she had not known existed until Arthur had described it to her in the entrance hall with the compressed urgency of a man editing 20 years of preparation down to its navigable essentials. The service road did not appear on the estate's official maps. Of course it did not. Arthur had thought of everything, had been thinking of everything, quietly, persistently, across 2 decades of waiting, building the infrastructure of Elara's escape before she knew she would need one, laying roads in the dark for a girl who had not yet learned she was worth the laying. She drove with both hands on the wheel and Clara's letter against her chest, and the sealed phone on the passenger seat, and the name, her father's name, moving through her mind with the particular rhythm of something that had always been true and was only now being permitted to exist in full daylight. She did not turn the phone on until she had been driving for 11 minutes, and the estate had disappeared entirely from the rearview mirror, and the service road had joined a civilian route that gave her 3 directions of exit if she needed them. She pulled to the side, locked the doors, turned the phone on. It contained one thing, a voice note. Arthur's voice, low, measured, carrying the same unshakable quality it carried in person, the voice of a man who had decided long ago that steadiness was the most useful thing he could offer the world and had spent decades perfecting its delivery. Elara, if you are hearing this, you have done everything correctly, and I am still alive, which means the plan held. Do not grieve me yet. There will be time for that if it becomes necessary, and I do not believe it will become necessary. A pause, the particular pause of a man choosing his next words with the care of someone who understands. They may be the most important words he has ever spoken. The briefcase is in the location I described. Inside it, you will find 4 things. The first is your father's address, current, verified 3 days ago. The second is a document he does not yet know exists, a legal instrument your mother filed 22 years ago that establishes, in a jurisdiction the network cannot reach, his biological paternity and its connection to the Dynasty Trust's original Hargrove bloodline provision. The third is an evidence package. Everything, every document, every forensic report, every financial record, every registry photograph, every intercepted communication, compiled, authenticated, and formatted for immediate legal deployment in 3 simultaneous jurisdictions. Another pause. Longer. The 4th thing is a letter. It is addressed to you, and I ask that you read it last, after you have looked at everything else, after you have had the time to understand the full architecture of what is in that case, after you are ready. Go to the briefcase, take everything, and then go to your father. He has been waiting 22 years without knowing he was waiting. It is time to end that. The voice note ended. Elara sat with the phone in her hand for exactly 30 seconds. She counted them, deliberately, because she had learned that 30 seconds of complete stillness before a significant movement was the difference between action and reaction, and everything from this point forward needed to be action. Then she drove. The location Arthur had described was a private storage facility 40 minutes from the estate, unassuming, clean, the kind of place that existed in the peripheral vision of a city without registering in its memory. Unit 47. a combination she had memorized along with the address on the night Arthur had pressed the midnight blue folder into her hands and told her to run. The unit was exactly as he had described it. Inside, on a clean metal shelf, surrounded by nothing, given the deliberate isolation of something that understood its own importance, sat a briefcase. Not worn, not tan leather. Not the case she had watched Arthur carry into the estate on the morning that changed everything. This one was different, darker, newer. The kind of case that had been purchased specifically for this purpose and had never been used for anything else. Its entire existence oriented toward this single moment of retrieval. She set it on the floor of the unit, crouched before it, pressed the combination Arthur had given her. Her mother's birthday, the same combination Edmund had never changed on his library cabinet, the number that connected everything, and the clasps released. She opened it. The first thing she saw was the envelope with her father's address. His name, the name from the back of the photograph, was written on the front in Arthur's handwriting. Beneath it, the address, a building in the city, a floor number, a unit. 40 minutes from where she was sitting. He had been 40 minutes away from her for however long he had been in that building. Had been breathing the same city air. Had been moving through the same streets. Had been 40 minutes from the daughter he did not know existed, while she had been in a house being systematically destroyed by a woman who had understood, better than anyone, that proximity was the most dangerous thing in the world if the two people involved ever found each other. She set the envelope aside. The evidence package was next, a thick, compressed collection of authenticated documents that carried the particular density of something that had been built with extraordinary patience over an extraordinary period of time. She did not read it fully. She did not need to. She understood its architecture from the work of the 3 folders. This was the complete version. The court-ready version, the version that did not require interpretation or supplementary explanation, because Arthur had spent 20 years making it self-sufficient. It was, she understood, a weapon. The most precise and devastating kind. The kind that does not require violence, because the truth, properly organized and presented in the right jurisdiction at the right moment, was more destructive than anything physical could ever be. She set it beside the address envelope. The third document, the legal instrument establishing her father's paternity, filed by Clara in a jurisdiction the network could not reach, she read in full. 3 pages. Clara's signature at the bottom of each one, witnessed by 2 names she did not recognize, notarized with a seal from a country that had no diplomatic relationship with any institution Viven had ever had access to. Clara had been thorough. Clara had been extraordinary. She said it with the others. Then she picked up the letter. Her name on the front. Arthur's handwriting. The envelope sealed not with wax, but with the simple pressure of a flap, intimate, unceremonialized, the sealing of something personal rather than legal. She opened it. Inside, 2 pages. And in the first paragraph, something that made her sit down fully on the floor of storage unit 47, with the letter in her hands, and the overhead fluorescent light humming above her, and the entire weight of the morning pressing down on her shoulders like a physical presence. Arthur had not simply been Elara's mother's lawyer. He had been Clara's closest friend, from before Edmund, from before the network, from the years when Clara Hargrove had been a young woman of extraordinary intelligence and perception, navigating a world that kept trying to reduce her, and had found, in the quiet, principled company of a young Arthur Greywell, the specific relief of someone who was seen completely and valued precisely for what they were. He had loved her. Not romantically. The letter was clear and careful about this distinction, but with the particular depth of a friendship that had been the most important relationship of his adult life, that had oriented his entire career, that had made him the man who spent 20 years in faithful vigil for a daughter Clara had trusted him to protect. I want you to know, the letter read, that everything I have done, every year of waiting, every document preserved, every contingency prepared, wasn't duty. It was love. The kind that outlasts the person it began with and finds, in the people they leave behind, its continuing reason. Your mother was the finest person I have ever known, and you are her in ways she would have wept to see. Go find your father, show him Clara's eyes, and then come back and let me watch you dismantle every single thing that was built on her grave. I will be there when you do. Elara sat on the floor of the storage unit and let herself have 60 seconds, not of grief, not of collapse, of the particular fullness of a person who has spent their entire life being emptied and has just, for the first time, been given something back. Then she stood, packed everything into the briefcase, picked it up, and walked back to the car with the focused directness of a woman who had somewhere to be. Behind her, in the city she was moving toward, a phone was ringing in a building on a specific floor in a specific unit. Her father's phone. Arthur was calling him. And 40 minutes away, at the Voss estate, Grace was standing at the entrance hall window, watching the vehicle with no plates send 2 men through the iron gates on foot. She had already locked every door. She was already calling the one number Arthur had given her for exactly this contingency. But the 2 men moving up the drive were moving faster than the call could connect, and they were not carrying anything that suggested they had come to talk. The 2 men reached the front door of the Voss estate in 40 seconds. Grace had locked it in 30. She stood in the entrance hall with her back against the mahogany paneling beside the door, not hiding, positioning, and listened to the specific quality of the silence outside that precedes men who have been sent to do something they intend to complete, regardless of resistance. She had heard that silence before. Not in this house, not in this life, but in the life that existed before this one. The life the network had recruited her from. The life she had spent 18 months trying to make mean something by watching over a girl they had sent her to surveil, and had instead, without intending to, sent her to love. The phone rang twice before it connected. The voice on the other end was not Arthur's. It was a woman, clipped, professional. The voice of someone operating from a location Grace had never been given and had known better than to ask for. 2 at the front, Grace said, her voice low and even. Vehicle with no plates on the drive, no visible weapons, but the approach pattern is not civilian. How long since they reached the door? 20 seconds. Move to the east wing, 3rd window from the landing. It opens from inside. Go now. Grace moved. She was through the entrance hall and onto the staircase in 6 seconds. The staircase she had watched Elara fall down. The staircase she had watched Viven stand at the top of with calculation in her eyes. And she took it fast, her practical shoes silent on the crimson carpet runner, her hand barely touching the gold banister. Behind her, the front door shuddered. Not a knock, not a doorbell. The particular shudder of a door being assessed from outside by people determining its weak points, a sound that is only recognizable to those who have had reason to learn it. Grace reached the landing, counted 3 windows from the left. The 3rd window opened inward on a latch that had, she noticed for the first time, been recently oiled. Recently. Within the last week. The latch moved without resistance, without the resistance of a mechanism left unattended, and Grace understood, as she pushed it open, that Arthur had been here, had prepared this, had oiled this specific latch at some point in the days before everything had accelerated, moving through the house quietly, maintaining the escape routes he had built into its architecture, the way a careful man maintains roads he hopes will never be needed, but cannot afford to let fall into disrepair. She was through the window and onto the narrow ledge and down the service drain pipe before the front door's lock gave way below her. She heard it give, a clean, professional breach, not the violence of a forced entry, but the quiet efficiency of a lock being defeated by someone who had done it many times before. And she dropped the last 4 feet to the ground and moved without looking back toward the east perimeter wall, where Arthur's preparation, she now understood, did not end with an oiled window latch. There was a door in the perimeter wall. Unlocked. She went through it, and the 2 men inside the estate found an entrance hall that was empty, and a briefcase that was gone, and a glass of water on the marble floor that was the only evidence anyone had been there at all. 41 minutes away, in a building that stood with the quiet confidence of something built by a man who did not need to announce itself. A phone rang on a desk beside a window that looked out over the city with the particular perspective of someone who had chosen this floor specifically because it allowed him to see everything below without being visible from it. The man who answered it was Nigerian, early 50s, deep dark brown skin, the kind of face that had been handsome in youth and had matured into something more compelling than handsomeness. The face of someone whose intelligence had become its dominant physical feature, whose eyes carried the specific weight of a person who had been fighting something enormous for a very long time and had not yet lost, but understood, with clear-eyed precision, exactly what the fight had cost him. He had been expecting Arthur's call. Not today. Not this week. But in the general territory of soon, because Arthur had contacted him 72 hours ago through a channel they had maintained, with careful irregularity, for 19 years. Had said only, "The conditions are approaching." Had said, "Be ready." Had said nothing else because nothing else had needed to be said between 2 men who had been circling the same truth from opposite sides of the same catastrophe for 2 decades. She found the briefcase, Arthur said. The man at the window closed his eyes for precisely 3 seconds. When he opened them, the city below was the same city. The light through the window was the same light. But something in the room had shifted. The particular shift of a space that has just been entered by a reality that changes the meaning of everything inside it. "She knows my name," he said. It was not a question. "Clara left it on the photograph," Arthur said. "She has known it since last night." A silence. "She's coming here?" "She's in a car right now," Arthur said. 40 minutes, perhaps less." Another silence. Longer. The kind that belongs to a man who has spent 22 years constructing, from the materials of absence and grief and the particular guilt of a person who survived something that took someone he loved, an internal architecture sturdy enough to function as a life, and has just been told that the thing he built it around the absence of is 40 minutes away. "Arthur," he said. His voice, for the first time in the conversation, carried something beneath its steadiness. "Does she?" "She has Clara's letter," Arthur said. "She knows everything." The man at the window set the phone down without ending the call. Stood at the window for exactly the 30 seconds that Elara had given herself on the side of a road. 30 seconds of complete stillness before significant movement, and then turned from it with the decisive energy of a man who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting and had just been handed the permission to stop. He picked up a second phone, made 3 calls in 4 minutes, calls that set in motion a legal, financial, and security infrastructure that had been built, quietly and at considerable personal cost, over the past 19 years, specifically for the day it would be needed. Then he put on his coat, and went to his door, and opened it. What neither Elara nor her father, nor Arthur, nor Grace could see from their respective positions in this morning's geography was what was happening simultaneously in a hotel suite in the city's financial district. A suite booked under a name that appeared nowhere in the registry, paid for in cash through a third-party arrangement, its occupant having checked in 4 days ago with a single bag, and the focused efficiency of a person who intended to stay only as long as necessary to complete a specific task. The suite's occupant was standing at its window, looking at the same city from a different angle. She was wearing black, not mourning black, not the theatrical black of a woman performing grief, but the specific black of someone who had stripped everything from her wardrobe that was not essential and had found that black was what remained. Her updo was perfect. Her gold jewelry was present. Her spine was straight. Vivian Calloway Voss looked out at the city that had watched her fall, that had processed the news of the will reading, the legal freeze, the investigation, the public whisper campaign that had begun the moment the corruption network's edges started to fray. And she did not look like a woman who had fallen. She looked like a woman who had landed. There was a distinction, a crucial one. A woman who has fallen is disoriented, still processing the drop, still mapping the distance between where she was and where she is, still grieving the altitude. A woman who has landed has already looked around, assessed the terrain, and begun building. Vivian had been building for 4 days. The phone on the desk behind her buzzed. She did not look at it immediately. She finished her assessment of the city, a slow, systematic scan from left to right, the same scan she had been performing every morning of her adult life, the scan of a woman who had grown up with nothing, looking at everything and calculating what was available to be taken. And then she turned, read the message. The message was from a number that did not exist in any directory, any registry, any record that could be subpoenaed. A number she had been given years ago and had used only twice before. Twice because the person on the other end of it did not tolerate unnecessary contact, and Vivian had spent 20 years understanding precisely what unnecessary meant to a person whose patience was the most powerful and most dangerous thing about them. The message contained 4 words. It is time, move. Vivian set the phone face down on the desk, and something moved across her face that had not been there in the entrance hall when Arthur read the will, had not been there on the morning Elara stood up from the marble floor, had not been there in any of the moments of the past week that had stripped her, publicly and legally and institutionally, of everything she had spent 20 years constructing. It was not the thin smile. It was something beneath the thin smile. Something that the thin smile had always been covering. The way a thin smile covers the specific expression of a person who has been playing a long game and has just reached the move they were always building toward. Because Vivian had lost the estate. She had lost the legal claim, the accounts, the social standing, the corrupted officials who were now too exposed to act openly on her behalf. But the person who had just sent her 4 words hadn't lost anything. Had never lost anything in 30 years of operation. And what that person was offering Vivian, in exchange for one final service, one final use of the instrument she had always been, was not the estate back, was not the dynasty, was not the life she had constructed and lost. It was something that made all of those things irrelevant. It was the legal destruction of Elara Voss's identity, not her inheritance, her identity. A challenge to the biological paternity claim that, if filed in the right jurisdiction through the right channels, with the right institutional pressure applied at precisely the right moment, would not simply freeze the dynasty transfer. It would invalidate the Hargrove bloodline provision entirely, retroactively nullify Clara's sealed will, and reduce Elara to exactly what Vivian had always told her she was. Nothing. A girl with no name that mattered. A girl with no claim that held. A girl who had been permitted, briefly, to believe she was something. and had then been reminded by the full institutional weight of a system that had been protecting the architect's interests for 3 decades, that believing and being were entirely different things. Vivienne picked up her coat. In 2 hours, she would be in a building on the other side of the city, sitting across a desk from a lawyer whose credentials were impeccable, and whose loyalty was absolute, and whose connection to the architect was so deeply embedded that it predated Vivienne herself by 15 years. In 4 hours, the filing would be complete, and Elara Voss, currently driving toward her father with her mother's letter against her chest, and 21 years of compressed fury finally given a direction, would receive a legal notification on the new phone Arthur had given her, a notification that would tell her, in the clean formal language of official documents, that her identity was being challenged in a jurisdiction she had never heard of, by a mechanism she had never encountered, through a legal instrument so obscure and so precisely targeted that not even Arthur had prepared a response to it, because Arthur had not known it existed, because the architect had never used it before, because he had been saving it. For exactly this, she found the building exactly where Arthur's envelope had said it would be. 12 stories, clean lines, the kind of architecture that does not announce itself, that has been designed, deliberately, to exist in the peripheral vision of a city without registering as significant until you are already inside it and have begun to understand that the absence of announcement is itself a form of statement. The statement of a man who had learned, at considerable cost, that visibility was invitation, and invitation was vulnerability, and vulnerability, in the world he had been navigating for 22 years, was something he could not afford. She sat in the car outside for 3 minutes, not from fear, from the specific recognition that some thresholds, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed, and that the threshold she was about to cross was the kind that divided a life into before and after with the permanent clarity of a clean cut. She had crossed several of those thresholds in the past. Weak, the will reading, Clara's letter, the name on the back of the photograph. Each one had restructured something in her that could not be returned to its previous configuration. This one was different from all of them. This one had a face. She got out of the car, walked through the building's front entrance, clean lobby, a security desk staffed by a man named James, who looked at her with the particular alertness of someone who had been given a description and was now confirming it, and took the elevator to the 9th floor without being stopped. James had called ahead. The elevator opened onto a corridor that was quiet in the specific way of a floor that contains only one occupied unit. All the ambient life compressed into a single point at the far end of the hall, behind a door that was, she saw, as she approached it, already open. Not fully. 3 inches. The open door of a man who had been told she was coming and had been unable to decide, in the 14 minutes, between Arthur's call and her arrival, whether to wait inside or in the corridor or at the elevator, and had resolved the indecision by opening the door and staying behind it, which was neither one thing nor the other, and was therefore, she understood with the intuition Clara had apparently known she would have, exactly right. She stopped outside the door, put her hand flat against it, pushed it open. Dr. Marcus Cole was standing at the window. His back was to her when she entered, and she had the impression, from the particular quality of his stillness, that he had positioned himself there deliberately, that he had understood, with the instinct of a man whose intelligence had always been his primary instrument, that the first moment needed to be navigated carefully, that turning to face a daughter you did not know you had required a specific kind of preparation that no amount of forewarning could fully provide, and that having his back to her for the first seconds gave them both a moment of adjustment before the full weight of the thing arrived. She stood inside the door, looked at him. He was everything the letter had said, and everything it had not said simultaneously. The build of a man who had once been physically powerful and had aged into something more considered. Silver threading through close-cropped dark hair. The posture of someone who had spent decades carrying something heavy and had learned to carry it without showing the weight. He turned, and Elara understood, in the precise moment that his eyes found her face, why Arthur had said what he had said in the letter. Why Grace had looked at her sometimes with an expression she had never been able to fully interpret. Why Viven, who had seen Clara's photograph before destroying it, who had looked at Elara across 21 years of daily proximity, had always seemed, beneath the cruelty, beneath the calculation, beneath the thin smile and the architectural gaslighting, to be looking at something that frightened her. Marcus Cole's eyes were looking at her from her own face, the same shape, the same depth, the same quality of complete attention, the particular gaze that Clara had described in her letter as seeing people entirely, that the network had identified as a bloodline characteristic, that Viven had spent 2 decades trying to extinguish because she had understood, even if she had never articulated it to herself in these terms, that a girl who could see people completely was a girl who would eventually see her. He crossed the room in 6 steps. He did not speak. There was nothing in the available vocabulary of the English language that was adequate for this specific moment. He was a man who had built his entire adult life on the precision of words. And he knew, with that same precision, when words were the wrong instrument entirely. He put both hands on her shoulders, looked at her face with the focused totality of someone reading, something they have been waiting to read for 22 years. And then, quietly, with the particular undoing of a man who has held himself together through an enormous and extended act of will, and has just been given permission to stop, he pulled her forward, and held on. Elara stood in the embrace of a father she had never met, and felt something move through her that had no name in any language she had been given. Something that existed below grief and above relief, in the specific register of a person receiving something they had stopped believing was possible, long before they had consciously decided to stop believing. She had been held before. She had not been held like this before. Like someone who was not going to let go because letting go had cost him everything the first time, and he was not, under any circumstances, going to pay that price again. 60 seconds passed, perhaps more. Neither of them counted. When he finally stepped back, hands still on her, shoulders not releasing entirely, the grip of someone maintaining contact, because contact was still too new and too necessary to risk interrupting. His eyes were doing the thing that Clara had described as his fundamental nature, reading her completely, taking her in with the full and undivided attention of a man who had missed the entirety of her existence and was attempting, in real time, to begin accounting for the absence. "You have her eyes," he said. His voice was low and precise, the voice of a man who had spent a career in rooms where words carried legal weight and had learned to give everything he said exactly as much force as it required, and not one syllable more. "I know," Elara said. "I didn't know," he said. "About you. I want you to know that I didn't know." "I know that too," she said. Clara's letter explained everything. Something moved across his face at the word Clara, the specific expression of a person for whom a name has never stopped carrying its full original weight despite 22 years of daily exposure to its absence. Not fresh grief. Something older and more settled, and in its settlement more profound. The grief of someone who has made peace with loss without ever making peace with the cause of it. "She was extraordinary," he said. "She was," Elara agreed. She built every door I needed before I was born, every single one. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then, in the controlled, measured way of a man whose intelligence had never required raised voices or dramatic gestures, who had always understood that the most devastating things were delivered quietly, he said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning. I have been building a case for 19 years, and I need to know what you know before we decide how to move." She opened her mouth to begin. Her phone buzzed. The new one. Arthur's phone. The one registered under a name that was not hers. She looked at the screen. A legal notification. Formal. Clean. The language of official documents that had been written by people who understood that the most violent acts could be dressed in the most neutral vocabulary. She read it once, read it again. Felt the floor shift in the specific way it shifted when Viven was involved. That particular reorganization of solid ground that she had learned to recognize as Viven's signature. The architectural destabilization that was her most reliable weapon. But this was not Viven's signature. This was something older. Something more precise. Something that had been crafted by a person who had watched Viven operate for 20 years and had then designed something that made Viven's methods look approximate. Her identity was being challenged in a jurisdiction she had never heard of. Clara's will, the instrument of everything, the document that had started all of this, the sealed ivory paper with its broken red wax that Arthur had read aloud in the entrance hall, while Viven's performance finally collapsed, was being retroactively contested on a biological paternity provision that, the notification informed her in its clean formal language, had been filed under a legal mechanism that predated the Dynasty Trust itself. She looked up at Marcus, handed him the phone without speaking. He read it, and the expression that crossed his face was not surprise. It was recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has seen a particular weapon used before, who has studied it, who has anticipated it, who has spent 19 years building a case that he had believed was comprehensive, and has just discovered that his opponent had one more instrument that he had not accounted for. He used the Hargrove provision reversal, Marcus said quietly. Not to Elara, to himself. The voice of a man thinking aloud because the thought was too large and too urgent to remain interior. I didn't think he would use it. I didn't think he still had access to the original. He stopped, looked at Elara. "Who is he?" Elara said. "The architect, the person above the governor, the person whose name Grace wrote on that paper." Arthur would not say it aloud. The notification gives a filing entity but not a name. "Who is he?" Marcus set the phone down on the table between them. He pulled out a chair. Sat down with the deliberate physicality of a man who needed to be fully grounded before he said the next thing. Who understood that what he was about to say would require Elara to be standing on the firmest possible ground, and was giving her the visual cue to find it. She sat across from him. He looked at her directly. "His name," Marcus said, "is Richard Hargrove." The room did not change. The light through the window was the same light. But inside, Elara, something went absolutely, completely, terrifyingly still. Because Hargrove was her mother's name. Hargrove was the bloodline the Dynasty Trust was built on. Hargrove was the family that had been paid, annually for 19 years, to stay silent about Clara's death. And Richard Hargrove was not a stranger whose name she was hearing for the first time. Richard Hargrove was her mother's brother. Her uncle. Her blood. The architect of everything that had been done to her had been her own family. Richard Hargrove, her mother's brother. The name sat in the center of the room, like something that had been dropped from a great height, not exploding on impact, but embedding itself, deeply, permanently, into the floor of every assumption Elara had constructed about the architecture of her own story. She had built her understanding of the enemy from the outside in. Viven first, then the governor, then the network, then the architect above all of it, and had been moving toward the center with the focused determination of someone excavating toward a source. She had not considered that the source was family. Had not considered. Could not have considered, because the human mind, even a mind sharpened by 21 years of survival, has a specific and almost unbreachable resistance to the possibility that the person who ordered the destruction of your life shares your blood and your mother's name, and had been, in the years before Elara was born, the person Clara trusted most completely in the world. He was her protector, Marcus said. His voice had dropped to the register he used when facts were too heavy for normal delivery, the low, precise tone of a man carrying weight he had not chosen. Before the network, before the money. When Clara was young, Richard was the person she called when the world became too much. He was 12 years older. He had established himself early. Law, finance, connections that ran deeper than either of them understood at the time. He was the one who introduced her to the world she eventually moved through. The world where she met Edmund. The world where she met me. He paused. He introduced me to Clara, Marcus said. He orchestrated that introduction. At the time, I believed it was generosity. I have spent 19 years understanding that it was reconnaissance. Elara looked at him. He was testing you, she said. He was measuring me, Marcus said, determining whether I was useful or threatening. And when, he determined that I was the second, that I was the kind of man who could not be absorbed, could not be bought, could not be made to look away from the things I saw. He used Clara to remove me, not violently, surgically, the way he did everything. He separated you. He built a deception so thorough that Clara and I both believed the other had chosen to end it, Marcus said. And then he pointed her toward Edmund, a good man, a manageable man, a man who loved Clara genuinely, but who was, in the specific way Richard needed him to be, controllable. Edmund's estate was the vehicle. Clara's trust was the asset. And Elara, he stopped, looked at her directly. You were the liability, he said. The Hargrove bloodline provision in the Dynasty Trust, the clause that gave the primary heir rights that superseded everything Edmund owned, passed through Clara's line. Richard had assumed he would inherit that provision when Clara died. He had built his entire financial architecture around that assumption. And then Clara produced an heir. Me, Elara said. You, Marcus said. And the provision passed to you automatically, completely, irrevocably. Richard had ordered Clara's death to clear his path to the dynasty. Instead, he had delivered it, through you, to the one person whose existence he had not accounted for. The silence that followed was the silence of a completed picture, every piece finally in its position, the image fully visible for the first time. Richard Hargrove had not simply been the architect of Vivian's operation. He had been the architect of everything. The separation of Clara and Marcus, Edmund's selection, Clara's murder, the sealed will hidden before it could be found and destroyed, the payments to his own family to buy their silence about his crime. Vivienne, recruited, deployed, maintained, protected, not as a partner, but as a tool, a mechanism. The public face of a private war that Richard had been, fighting against his own bloodline for 30 years. Elara opened her mouth. The door to Marcus's apartment came off its hinges. Not slowly. Not with the preliminary warning of a lock being defeated or a handle being turned. It came off in a single explosive movement. The door and its frame simultaneously. The particular violence of a breach performed by people with equipment and training and the specific absence of any intention to be subtle about what they were doing. 4 men. Dark clothing. No markings. The first one through the door had his eyes on Marcus before he had fully cleared the frame, the targeting priority of someone who had been briefed on the room's occupants and had been given a specific instruction about which one mattered most. Marcus moved. Elara had not known he could move like that. Had not known. Could not have inferred from the stillness of a man at a window, from the precise quietness of his voice, from the measured deliberateness of everything he had done since she arrived, that beneath the controlled exterior of a principled legal architect was someone who had spent 19 years preparing for the possibility that preparation would eventually not be enough, and that the moment it wasn't would require something entirely different. He was between Elara and the first man in 2 steps. The second man came from the left. Marcus took the impact against his shoulder, absorbed it, redirected it, used the momentum with the practiced efficiency of someone who had trained for this specific scenario, in the specific knowledge that the scenario was not hypothetical, and put the second man into the wall beside the window with a force that shook the glass in its frame. The third and fourth men had Elara. She felt the grip on her arms before she had fully processed the breach, the particular grip of people who had been told to restrain rather than harm, which was its own kind of information. And she did not fight it immediately. She filed it, processed the room, counted the men, their positions, the door, the window. Marcus still upright, and now with the first man between himself and the fourth. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. Her hand was restrained. But her left hand, the hand that had pressed against a marble floor and pushed her upright from the bottom of a staircase 3 weeks ago, the hand that had carried her mother's photograph for 14 years, was slightly less restrained than her right. She pressed the single button on Arthur's phone that she had been told, in the voice note, existed for exactly this purpose. 1 press. That was all. She pressed it. And then the window broke inward, not from outside pressure, from a rope. A figure came through it, fast, controlled, the entry of someone who had been on the exterior of the building waiting for a signal, and landed in a crouch on the apartment floor with the particular economy of motion of someone for whom this wasn't the first window and would not be the last. He straightened. Wire-framed glasses, silver gray hair, a dark coat, not the worn one, a different one, newer. The coat of a man who had shed his previous identity along with his previous coat and was operating now without the weight of either. Arthur Graywell looked around the room with the calm assessment of someone arriving exactly on schedule. The 2 men holding Elara looked at him. In their hesitation, the involuntary 2-second pause of people confronted with something their briefing had not included, something that should not have been possible. A dead man standing in a 9th-floor apartment with rope still running from his harness to the window frame. Elara moved, left hand first, then right. Then the full directed momentum of a woman who had been pushed down a staircase and had stood back up, and had not, in the week since, stopped standing. The third man went down. The fourth retreated toward the door. Marcus had the first man fully contained. Arthur, moving with the unhurried precision of a man who had come prepared, produced from his coat a device the size of a phone and pressed it once. The building's power cut, emergency lighting activated, dim, red-tinged, the particular light of a situation that has formally declared itself an emergency. In the red light, the fourth man made a decision. He reached into his coat. "Don't," Arthur said. The word arrived in the same register he had used for everything across the entirety of their acquaintance. Quiet, final, carrying the specific authority of a person who means precisely what they say, and has never once needed to say anything twice. The fourth man looked at him. "Put both hands up." Marcus crossed the room to Elara in 4 steps, both hands on her face, checking her with the focused urgency of a father who has had his daughter for 40 minutes, and has nearly lost her in that same 40 minutes, and is not yet equipped, at this early stage of the relationship, to process that with anything resembling composure. "I'm fine," she said. "You're bleeding," he said. She touched her temple. Her hand came away with a thin line of red, from the 4th man's grip, from a ring she had not registered. A small wound that was nothing compared to the ones she had survived, but that Marcus was looking at with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. Protective rage, clean, focused, and absolutely without limit. "I'm fine," she said again, and this time it was not reassurance, it was instruction. "Arthur, tell me you have what we need." Arthur looked at her across the dim red room, the 4 men contained, the window behind him open to the city air, the rope still hanging against the building's exterior, like the punctuation of an entrance nobody had seen coming. "I have everything," he said. "Then we move now," Elara said. "Tonight. All 3 jurisdictions, simultaneously. Before Richard files anything else. Before Viven completes whatever she is building. Before they recalibrate from this." She looked at Marcus, then Arthur, then back. "Tell me I'm right." Marcus and Arthur looked at each other, the look of 2 men who had been on opposite sides of the same vigil for 20 years and had just, in a 9th-floor apartment with emergency lighting and a broken window and rope marks on the frame, finally been in the same room. "You're right," Marcus said. "There is one problem," Arthur said. His voice had changed. Not much, imperceptibly, to anyone who had not spent the past weeks learning to read the specific registers of Arthur Graywell's emotional architecture. But Elara had spent those weeks, and she heard it. The change was not fear. It was the specific quality of a man about to deliver the piece of information he had been holding back, the piece he had known was coming, had been building toward, had not yet found the moment for, because every moment before this one had contained something more immediately urgent. There was never going to be a perfect moment. "The evidence package in the briefcase," Arthur said. "The authenticated documents, the forensic reports, the financial records, the registry." He paused. "I compiled them over 20 years. I authenticated them. I organized them for simultaneous deployment in 3 jurisdictions." "I know," Elara said. "I read the briefcase." "What you don't know," Arthur said, "is that one of the 3 authentication signatures, the one that validates the forensic chain of custody for Dr. Adeora's amended autopsy report, belongs to a witness who has been in this story since before any of us understood what the story was." The red emergency light hummed. "The witness," Arthur said, "is the only person whose signature can validate that specific document in the specific jurisdiction where it carries the most legal weight." "Who is it?" Marcus asked. Arthur looked at Elara, not at Marcus, at Elara, with the expression of a man delivering the thing he had been dreading most, not because it was dangerous, not because it was legally complex, but because of what it meant to the person receiving it, because of what it would require her to do, because of the specific and brutal irony of a story that had spent 3 parts building toward a reckoning, only to reveal, in the moment the reckoning was within reach, that the final key was held by the last person anyone would have chosen. "The authentication witness," Arthur said quietly, "is your maternal grandmother." Elara stared at him. "Clara's mother," Arthur continued, "Margaret Hargrove, Richard's mother, 81 years old, living under Richard's care, has been living under Richard's care for the past 15 years." The room was silent except for the hum of the emergency lighting. "She signed the document," Arthur said, 22 years ago, as a witness to Dr. Adeora's findings, because Clara asked her to, because Clara trusted her completely. And Richard doesn't know she signed it, Marcus said slowly, understanding arriving. Richard has never known, Arthur said, because Clara hid the copy, filed it in the jurisdiction where it has been waiting. And Margaret, 81 years old, living inside Richard's house, inside Richard's care, inside Richard's absolute institutional control for 15 years. He stopped. She is the only person who can authenticate the autopsy report, Elara said. Her voice was completely level. And she is living inside the house of the man who had her daughter murdered. Yes, Arthur said. And Richard doesn't know she is the key, Elara said. Not yet, Arthur said. But when he realizes the Hargrove provision reversal has been filed and we move to counter it, when he sees the jurisdictional filing and traces its authentication chain, he will find her signature within 48 hours, which means, Marcus said, we have 48 hours to get to Margaret Hargrove before Richard realizes she is the one thing standing between him and the complete destruction of our case. The 4 contained men in the room were listening to all of this. Arthur looked at them, then at Elara. We have one more problem, he said. What? She said. Arthur reached into his coat and produced a photograph. Recent, printed on the same paper as the surveillance photographs in the 3rd sealed folder. He held it out. Elara took it, looked at it. The photograph showed a restaurant, a corner table. 2 people, one with his back to the camera, unidentifiable. The other facing forward, fully visible, caught in the specific intimacy of a conversation that was not professional, not casual, not the body language of people meeting for the first time. The person facing the camera was someone she knew, someone she had trusted, someone who had been in this story from a position of absolute moral clarity, whose loyalty she had never once questioned, whose motivations she had never had reason to examine, whose presence in her life she had accepted as one of the few things that was simply, cleanly, entirely what it appeared to be. The person facing the camera in the restaurant photograph was James, the security guard from the lobby of Marcus's building, the man who had looked at her with alert recognition when she entered, the man who had called ahead. Who had called ahead? He didn't call your father, Arthur said quietly. He called the number he was paid to call, the number he has been paid to call for the past 3 years. Elara looked up from the photograph. Richard knew I was coming here, she said. Richard has known every move since the moment you left the estate, Arthur said. The breach tonight was not a response to the filing. It was not a response to anything that happened today. He looked at her with the focused gravity of a man, delivering the piece of information that restructures everything. It was scheduled, Arthur said. It was always scheduled for today. Because Richard has known from a source we have not yet identified, that today was the day you would find the briefcase, find Marcus, find everything. He has someone else, Marcus said. His voice was quiet, with the specific quiet of a man who has just watched his own security perimeter revealed as compromised. Inside our operation, someone neither of us placed. Someone, Arthur said, who has been there long enough to know things that only someone very close to this story could know. The red emergency light hummed. The city outside the broken window continued its indifferent motion, and Elara stood in the center of a room full of contained men and broken glass, and a father she had known for 40 minutes, and a dead man who was not dead, and a photograph of a betrayal she had not seen coming, and understood, with the particular clarity that had always been her inheritance from both her parents, that the thing she had believed was the war had only been the recruitment. The war itself had not yet begun. And somewhere in the city, in a building she did not know, at a desk she had never seen, Richard Hargrove, her mother's brother, the architect of 30 years of catastrophic design, was looking at a screen that told him his men had failed, and was picking up a phone, and was calling the person inside their operation, the person neither Marcus nor Arthur had placed, the person who answered on the first ring, and said in a voice that Elara would have recognized anywhere, a voice she had heard every day for the past several weeks, a voice she had come to associate with safety and steadiness and the particular comfort of being genuinely witnessed. "Yes, I'm still here. Yes, I'm still here." The voice came through Richard's phone clearly enough that the three people standing in the wreckage of Marcus's apartment, emergency lighting still casting everything in its dim red register, broken glass still on the floor, the four contained men still against the wall, heard it without effort. Because Arthur had the room wired, had wired it in the 14 minutes between his call to Marcus and Elara's arrival. 14 minutes that he had not spent waiting, but had spent moving through the apartment with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that the most important intelligence was never what your enemy told you directly, but what they said when they believed you could not hear them. The voice on Richard's phone belonged to Grace. The silence that followed its identification lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which Elara stood completely still and processed what her ears had delivered and her mind refused. For those 4 seconds to fully ratify, because Grace had sat beside her on the marble floor. Grace had escaped the estate through Arthur's prepared window. Grace had handed Arthur the folded paper with Richard's name. Grace had been, in the architecture of the past 72 hours, the closest thing to uncomplicated loyalty that this story had contained. And Grace was Richard's, had always been Richard's, not the network's, not Vivienne's. Richard specifically, placed not to monitor Elara's psychological state for the broader organization, but to report directly to the man at the top, to feed him the precise interior intelligence that no external surveillance could provide. The quality of Elara's resistance, the depth of her understanding, the moments when she came closest to the truth, the moment she found the letter in the cabinet, the moment she pocketed Arthur's card. Every calibration Richard had made in the weeks leading to this day had been made with Grace's information as its foundation. The paper Grace had handed Arthur, the paper with Richard's name on it, had not been an act of defection. It had been a delivery. Richard had wanted Arthur to know he was coming, had wanted the name delivered in exactly that way, through a trusted hand, at exactly that moment. Because a man who knows his enemy is coming has the illusion of preparation, and an enemy who believes he is prepared moves differently than one who does not. Moves with slightly less caution, slightly more confidence, slightly more exposure. Richard had handed them his name because he wanted them to feel ready. She fed him everything, Marcus said. His voice was very quiet, the voice of a man absorbing a security breach of a depth that required complete recalibration of everything he had believed was protected. Every conversation in that apartment, every document I prepared, every jurisdictional strategy I built. The 48-hour window for Margaret, Arthur said, equally quiet. He already knows about it. Elara looked at Arthur. "How long have you known about Grace?" she asked. Arthur held her gaze. 47 minutes, he said. "The emergency signal you pressed activated a monitoring protocol I had running on all communication devices in this building's vicinity. Her call to Richard registered the moment it connected." A pause. "I am sorry I could not tell you before you processed it yourself." Elara nodded once, filed it. "Then we don't have 48 hours, she said. "We have whatever time it takes Richard to move on Margaret from the moment he decides we know about her, which is now, which means we have hours, not days." She looked at Marcus. "Where is she?" Exactly. Marcus was already at his desk, the desk she had not paid attention to on her arrival, focused as she had been on the window and the man at it, but which she now registered as the surface of someone who had been building a case for 19 years. Organized, dense with files and maps and the particular layered documentation of a person who had been living inside a single problem for long enough that the problem had become the furniture. Richard's primary residence, Marcus said, pulling a folder without needing to search for it. A private estate, 80 miles north. Margaret Hargrove has been in residence there for 15 years, described in all public records as receiving family care for age-related health concerns. He looked up. She is not ill. I have had a medical contact confirm her condition twice in the past 3 years. She is 81 years old, and she is in full possession of herself. She is not receiving care. She is being held, Elara said. She is being contained, Marcus said. Comfortably. Completely. In the way that Richard contains everything, not with visible violence, but with the removal of every mechanism of independent action. No personal phone, no unsupervised visitors, no access to legal counsel that is not Richard's legal counsel. She doesn't know she is the key, Arthur said. She signed that document 22 years ago as a witness for Clara. She may not even remember doing it. Or she may remember and have spent 15 years understanding that remembering it openly would... He stopped. Would sign her own death warrant, Elara finished. The room was silent. Then the second phone, Marcus's personal device, separate from everything Arthur had wired. The phone that connected to the external world through a channel that had not been compromised because it predated Grace's deployment by a decade. Rang. Marcus looked at the screen. His face did something Elara had not seen it do in the 43 minutes she had known him. Something that bypassed the controlled intelligence and the measured precision and reached the layer underneath. The layer of a person who has built 20 years of professional fortification around an emotional wound and has just been struck directly on it. He answered. Put it on speaker without being asked. The instinct of a man who had decided, in the moment he pressed the button, that Elara needed to hear everything from this point forward. That there had been enough things she had been protected from by people who loved her, and that the protection had cost her more than the knowledge would have. The voice on the other end was male, American, older, the specific vocal texture of someone in their late 70s, carrying the authority of a person accustomed to being the most significant presence in any room. Marcus, the voice said, I understand my sister's daughter has found you. Richard Hargrove's voice was not what Elara had constructed in her imagination across the hours since Marcus had said his name. She had built something colder, something with the architectural quality of Vivian's worst register, the particular vocal signature of performed warmth stripped away to reveal machinery beneath. Richard did not sound like machinery. He sounded like a patriarch. Warm, regretful, carrying the specific emotional register of a man who wanted, genuinely wanted, or wanted to sound like he genuinely wanted, to be understood rather than feared. The voice of someone who had spent decades being the most powerful person in every room and had learned that power, deployed with warmth, was exponentially more effective than power deployed with coldness. Vivienne had been cold. Richard was warm. That was the distinction. That was the thing that made him categorically more dangerous than anything Elara had faced before. I would like to speak with her, Richard said. Marcus looked at Elara. She held out her hand for the phone. He gave it without hesitation, the trust of a man who had known her for less than an hour and had already understood, from Clara's eyes looking out of her face and from the quality of her stillness in a room that had just been breached and had not broken her, that she did not need to be protected from this conversation. She needed to have it. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. A pause. Brief. The pause of a man recalibrating, updating his model of who he was dealing with based on the single data point of how she had said his name. Not Uncle. Not Richard. Mr. Hargrove. The address of someone establishing terms before the conversation had properly begun. "Elara," he said. The warmth deepened slightly, the specific modulation of someone turning up the temperature of their delivery in response to an opening that was cooler than they had expected. "I have wanted to speak with you for a very long time." "I find that difficult to believe," she said, "given the considerable effort you have invested in ensuring I remained unaware of your existence." Another pause. Longer. And in that pause, in the specific quality of Richard Hargrove's silence, in the 3-second recalibration of a man who had been the most intelligent person in every room for 30 years and had just encountered something in a 21-year-old sentence construction that required genuine reassessment, Elara understood something that clarified the entire war she was about to fight. Richard had underestimated her, had built his entire operation around the assumption that the girl Viven had spent 21 years diminishing was in fact diminished. He had not accounted for what survived the diminishment. He had not accounted for Clara. "I want to make you an offer," Richard said. "I'm not interested in your offer," Elara said. "You haven't heard it." "I don't need to," she said. "You had my mother killed. You poisoned my father, the man who raised me. You built a network of corruption that used institutional power to keep a child isolated and abused for 21 years. You placed a woman in my home to surveil me. You sent men through a door tonight to hurt the father I found this morning." She paused. "There is no version of an offer from you that I am interested in hearing." Silence. Then, and this was the thing that sent the temperature of the room down several degrees, the thing that made Marcus and Arthur exchange a look across the dim red light of the emergency lamps, the thing that told Elara she was not dealing with Vivien's category of opponent. Richard laughed. Not the laugh of a villain enjoying cruelty. Not theatrical. Not performed. The genuine, surprised, almost admiring laugh of a man who had not expected to be impressed and found himself, despite everything, impressed. "She really did give you everything," he said quietly. "Clara, she really did." A pause. "I'm going to visit my mother tomorrow morning," Richard said. The warmth was gone. What replaced it was not cold. It was simply neutral. The neutrality of someone stating a fact that is also a threat and does not need the register of a threat because the fact itself is sufficient. "I visit her every Sunday. I have visited her every Sunday for 15 years. I find it very important to maintain family connection." The call ended. The emergency lighting hummed. Marcus was already at his desk, pulling keys, a second phone, a document she had not seen before. "We leave in 4 minutes," he said. "If we drive through the night, we reach Richard's estate by dawn. Margaret will be alone in the East Wing until he arrives at 10 in the morning." "We have a 4-hour window," Arthur said. 3, Elara said. "He said tomorrow morning. He will move the window forward now that he knows we heard him." She was already at the door, then stopped, turned back. The 4 contained men against the wall, the broken door, the rope against the building's exterior, the glass on the floor, and something else. Something she had registered on entry and filed and had not returned to until this moment. A detail so small and so precisely placed that it had the specific quality of something left deliberately. Something that wasn't part of the breach. Something that had been in this apartment before the 4 men arrived, on Marcus's desk. Beneath the folder he had pulled the keys from, a photograph, not surveillance quality, personal, old. The The photograph of a woman, young, Nigerian, luminous, natural hair, the specific warmth of someone caught in a moment of genuine happiness. The same woman as the photograph in Elara's shoe. On the back of this one, in handwriting she had never seen before, not Clara's loops and angles, not Arthur's measured print. A single line. She trusted me first. Forgive me last. Elara turned it over, looked at the face, looked at the handwriting on the back. Arthur, she said. Her voice had changed, had taken on the specific quality of a person who has found the final piece of a picture they didn't know was incomplete. Whose handwriting is this? Arthur crossed the room, looked at the photograph, at the writing, and went, completely still. That, he said, in a voice she had never heard from him, stripped of its steadiness, stripped of its 20 years of patient preparation, stripped all the way down to something raw and unguarded and almost unrecognizable as belonging to Arthur Greywell, is Margaret Hargrove's handwriting. The photograph had not been left by Richard's men. It had been left before they arrived. Margaret Hargrove, 81 years old, living under Richard's care, no personal phone, no unsupervised visitors, no independent legal access, had somehow gotten a photograph into Marcus Cole's apartment, which meant Margaret Hargrove knew they were coming, which meant Margaret Hargrove had been waiting, which meant the woman they were racing through the night to reach had already, in the specific and extraordinary way of a woman who had raised Clara Hargrove and recognized her daughter's fingerprints on a plan across 22 years of distance, already made her move. They left Marcus's apartment at 11:43 at night, 3 of them. Marcus driving, his hands on the wheel with the focused grip of a man who had waited 22 years for a direction to drive in, and was not, now that he had one, going to waste a single mile of it. Arthur in the passenger seat, the real briefcase between his feet, his wire-framed glasses catching the passing city lights in brief successive flashes, like a man reading the darkness as it came toward him. Elara in the back with Clara's letter against her chest and Margaret's photograph in her hand, and the particular internal stillness of someone who has passed through the outer atmosphere of fear and has arrived at something beyond it, something that hadn't conventional name, but that functioned in the body, like the specific calm that exists on the other side of having nothing left to lose. She was not calm because she was not afraid. She was calm because she had decided. There was a distinction. She had learned it from 21 years of living with a woman who had mistaken Elara's endurance for weakness, had never understood that the girl who did not fight back was not a girl without fight, but a girl who had not yet found the thing worth fighting for completely. The thing that required everything. The thing that justified the full deployment of every resource she had been quietly, unknowingly, accumulating across 2 decades of survival. She had found it now. It had a name, several names actually. Clara, Edmund, Arthur, Marcus, Margaret. The $900 billion dynasty that had been built on her mother's blood and stolen with her mother's murder, and was going to be reclaimed, not because Elara needed the money. She had never needed the money, had spent 21 years needing something that money could not provide, but because the reclaiming of it was the most complete and permanent and legally devastating form of accountability available to her. Because Richard Hargrove had spent 30 years building his power on top of Clara's grave, and there was only one appropriate response to that: tear it down to the foundation, salt the earth beneath it, and build something on top of it that Clara would have recognized. The photograph, Marcus said from the front, not taking his eyes from the road. Margaret placed it before Richard's men arrived, which means she had access to my apartment at some point in the past. 72 hours, Arthur said. The photo paper is the same stock as the surveillance prints in the third folder. It was printed recently, within the past 3 days. She has a contact, Elara said. Someone who can move between Richard's estate and the city without triggering his monitoring. She has been building toward this, Arthur said quietly. I should have seen it. 15 years inside Richard's house, 15 years of Sunday visits and supervised access, and the complete removal of independent action. A woman who raised Clara Hargrove does not spend 15 years in those conditions without doing something with the time. She was waiting, Elara said. The same way you were waiting, the same way Marcus was waiting. Differently, Arthur said. We were waiting from the outside. Margaret has been waiting from inside the machine, which is more dangerous, Marcus said, and more valuable. The city fell away behind them. The road opened into the darkness of a highway that ran north through the particular emptiness of late-night American landscape. Flat stretches of agricultural land, the occasional overpass, the lights of distant clusters of life that appeared and disappeared with the rhythm of a world that was asleep and had no knowledge of the 3 people moving through its peripheral darkness toward a confrontation that had been building for 30 years. Elara's phone buzzed. Arthur's phone, the one registered under a different name. She looked at the screen. A news alert. Not legal. Journalistic. A breaking story filed 40 minutes ago from a publication she recognized as one of the 3 major national outlets that the Voss dynasty's historical social connections had always maintained a cultivated relationship with. She read the headline, read it again. Exclusive. Questions raised over Elara Voss mental health history as dynasty inheritance claim faces legal challenge. Sources close to estate. Site documented psychological instability. Viven. Not the legal challenge. That was Richard's instrument. This was Vivien's. The falsified psychological records that Viven had been quietly building since Elara was 15. The credibility destruction that had been assembled across years of careful fabrication was now being deployed publicly through a media outlet that had been specifically selected for its reach and its historical credibility. The story cited sources, multiple sources, named a specific psychological evaluation, the one Elara now knew had been commissioned by Viven through a compliant practitioner that described her as prone to paranoid ideation, delusional thinking, and a documented pattern of fabricating persecution narratives. It described her inheritance claim as the product of a disturbed mind exploiting a vulnerable legal instrument. It described Arthur Graywell as a disgraced attorney with a history of professional misconduct. Misconduct that Elara knew had been fabricated, that had appeared in no record before this week, that had been constructed specifically for this moment. It described Marcus Cole as a known associate with a history of exploiting vulnerable individuals through manufactured emotional connection. It was thorough. It was devastating. And it had been published 40 minutes ago, which meant it had been written before tonight. Had been written and submitted and approved and queued while Richard's men were still in Marcus's apartment, while Grace was still playing the role of defector, while Viven was still in her hotel suite, pulling on her coat to go file the legal challenge. The media strike and the legal challenge and the physical breach had not been 3 separate responses. They had been 3 simultaneous prongs of a single coordinated attack. Planned, rehearsed, executed with the precision of people who had spent years preparing for the specific day that Elara found the briefcase and found her father, and finally became the threat they had always known she would become. Arthur, she said. I see it, he said. He had his own screen open, had been watching the same alert through a separate monitoring channel. It will spread by morning. Every major outlet will have picked it up by 6 a.m. By the time we reach Richard's estate, it will be the primary narrative surrounding the dynasty claim. Can we counter it? Marcus asked. With the evidence package, yes, Arthur said. But not before morning. Not before it has already done the damage it was designed to do. Which is what, specifically? Elara asked, keeping her voice level. Keeping herself inside the calm she had chosen, because the calm was not a feeling. It was a decision. And decisions did not require the cooperation of circumstances. It poisons the jurisdictional filings, Arthur said. A judge reading the simultaneous legal deployment will have already seen the story by the time the filing lands on their desk. The credibility contamination is the point. They don't need to prove she is unstable. They only need to install the question. Then we file before morning, Elara said. We don't have the authentication signature, Marcus said. Without Margaret, I know, Elara said. Drive faster. Marcus drove faster. The highway unspooled ahead of them, and the darkness on either side of it was the specific darkness of a night that was not simply the absence of light, but the presence of something, the accumulated weight of a story that had been building for 30 years in the dark and was now, at 11:57 on a Wednesday night, finally approaching the place where the dark ended and whatever came after it began. Elara looked at Margaret's photograph. She trusted me first. Forgive me last. What had Margaret done? What had she been holding for 22 years in the silence of Richard's Sunday visits? What did a woman know? What had she chosen to know? And what had she chosen not to know? And what had knowing cost her across 15 years of living inside the house of a son who had murdered her daughter? And what did forgive me last mean from a woman who had signed a document that could dismantle everything? Forgive me for what? For signing? For not coming forward sooner? For something else. Something that had not yet surfaced. Something that existed in the story's architecture beneath everything they had already found. Something that Margaret had been carrying in the specific silence of a woman who understood that certain truths needed to wait for the person who could survive receiving them. Elara was still turning the photograph over in her hands, front to back, back to front. Clara's face and Margaret's handwriting cycling through her fingers in the dark of the back seat, when the car's headlights picked up something on the road ahead. A vehicle, parked across both lanes. Not a breakdown. Not an accident. Positioned, the deliberate diagonal of a roadblock, its hazard lights off, two figures standing beside it in the darkness, with the particular stillness of people who had been waiting for a specific car to arrive. Marcus hit the brakes. The car slowed to a stop 40 meters from the blockade. The two figures did not move. For 3 seconds, nobody in the car spoke. Then the figure on the left raised one hand, not aggressively, not with the directional authority of law enforcement, but with the specific open palm gesture of someone signaling recognition. Someone who wanted to be understood as known rather than threatening. Someone who had been expecting this car specifically, and had been waiting for it specifically, and had placed themselves across this specific road at this specific hour, because they had known, with the certainty of someone operating from inside information, that this was the route Marcus would take. The figure on the left took 3 steps toward the car, into the reach of the headlights. Elara looked at the face that the headlights revealed, and the calm she had chosen, the decision rather than the feeling, the thing she had built on the other side of fear, held completely. Because the face in the headlights was old, 81 years old, with Clara's bone structure underneath the age, and Clara's eyes, the same eyes that looked out of Elara's face, the same eyes that Marcus had seen in a daughter he had not known existed, looking directly through the windshield at Elara. Margaret Hargrove had not waited to be rescued. She had come to them. And the figure standing beside her, the contact, the person who had moved between Richard's estate and the city, the person who had printed the photograph and placed it in Marcus's apartment and had been operating in complete silence inside Richard's household for longer than Grace had been inside Vivian's, was someone none of them had ever seen before. A young man, early 20s, Nigerian American, with a face that shared something with the woman beside him. Something in the jaw, the eyes, the particular set of a person who has grown up carrying a secret so large it has become structural. He was looking at Elara with the expression of someone seeing a person they have known about their entire life and are meeting for the first time. Arthur made a sound, not words, something below words. The involuntary sound of a man who has just had his understanding of a 22-year story revised in a single headlit moment. "Arthur," Marcus said carefully. "Who is that?" Arthur's voice, when it came, was the voice of a man for whom the ground had just moved in a direction he had not mapped and had not prepared for, and could not, in this moment, fully process. "That," Arthur said, "is Clara's son." Nobody moved for 7 seconds. The headlights held Margaret Hargrove and the young man beside her in the particular clarity of illumination that does not flatter and does not soften, that simply reveals, completely and without editorial, what is actually there. And what was there on a midnight road 80 miles north of the city was an 81-year-old woman who had been living inside the house of the man who murdered her daughter and had spent 15 years not breaking and not surrendering and not disappearing into the particular erasure that Richard Hargrove had designed her life to be. And a young man whose face carried Clara Hargrove's bone structure with the unmistakable fidelity of direct inheritance. Marcus was the first one out of the car, not running, moving with the compressed urgency of a man who understood that speed and steadiness were not opposites in this moment, but requirements of equal necessity, that the woman on that road was 81 years old and had just crossed whatever distance separated Richard's estate from this highway in the middle of the night through means nobody had yet explained, and that what she needed from the first person who reached her was not drama, but presence. He reached her, looked at her face. Margaret Hargrove looked back at him with Clara's eyes set inside 81 years of accumulated weight, the specific weight of a woman who had made choices she could not undo, had watched consequences she could not stop, and had spent 15 years inside a silence so complete and so enforced that breaking it felt, Elara imagined, less like speaking and more like a structure finally releasing the pressure it had been built to contain. "Marcus," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this moment 10,000 times across 15 years of Sunday visits and supervised access and the particular performance of an elderly woman in declining health that she had maintained with the focused discipline of someone who understood that the performance was the only protection she had. "Margaret," Marcus said. Then, because there was nothing adequate, "I'm sorry it took this long." "It took exactly as long as it needed to," she said. "Clara built it that way. She understood timing better than any of us." Elara stepped out of the car. Margaret turned to look at her. And what crossed the old woman's face in that moment, the specific compound of grief and recognition, and the particular joy that exists only in the presence of someone who carries the physical evidence of a person you loved and lost, was the most unguarded thing Elara had witnessed in the entirety of this story. More unguarded than Viven stripped of her performance. More unguarded than Marcus at the window. More unguarded even than Arthur, coming through the 9th floor window with rope still on his harness. Margaret opened her arms. Elara walked into them, and held the only living person who had known Clara completely, who had raised her, who had watched her become extraordinary, who had signed a document 22 years ago as a witness to the truth of her daughter's murder, and had been living inside the consequence of that signature ever since. She would have been so proud, Margaret said into Elara's hair. She already was. She knew what you would be before you arrived. They moved off the road. Marcus had identified a service road 40 meters back, the practical instinct of a man who had spent 19 years operating in the margins of visibility, and they gathered in the darkness beside it, the car's interior lights providing the only illumination, the highway empty in both directions, with the specific emptiness of a world that had agreed, without being asked, to give this particular group of people this particular hour without interruption. The young man's name was Daniel Cole, not Hargrove. Cole, a name Margaret had given him quietly in the registration of his birth, through a channel Richard had not monitored because Richard had not known Daniel existed. Clara's second pregnancy, conceived 4 months before her death, delivered in absolute secrecy, through a private medical arrangement that Margaret had organized herself with the focused desperation of a woman trying to preserve one thing from the wreckage of what was coming. 6 weeks after Clara died. Richard had not known, had never known. Margaret had given the infant to a family she trusted completely, a family that had raised Daniel with full knowledge of his origins, in careful contact with Margaret, through channels Richard could not trace, waiting for the day that the sealed will's conditions were met and the story could finally be told in full. Daniel was 21 years old. He had his mother's bone structure and his mother's eyes, and Elara registered this with a recognition that moved through her like a current. Marcus Cole's jaw. "You're my brother," Elara said. Not a question. A statement being spoken aloud for the first time by someone who had spent 21 years as an only child in a house that had done everything in its power to make her feel like she was not even that. Not even a child. Barely a person. Certainly not someone who deserved the uncomplicated fact of family. Daniel looked at her. He had been quiet since the car stopped. Quiet with the specific quality of a young man who had grown up knowing this moment was coming and had prepared for it intellectually across years of careful preparation, and was now discovering that intellectual preparation and the actual arrival of the thing were categorically different experiences. "Yeah," he said. His voice was young and unguarded, and nothing like the measured register of Arthur or Marcus, or the performed registers of everyone on the other side of this story. It was simply, cleanly, the voice of a 21-year-old who had just met his sister on a midnight road and had decided that the only appropriate response was honesty. "I'm your brother." Elara held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned to Margaret. "Tell me everything," she said. "Quickly. All of it. We have less than 3 hours." Margaret talked for 40 minutes. She talked with the focused precision of a woman who had been composing this testimony in her mind for 15 years, who had rehearsed it in the silence of Sunday visits, in the enforced stillness of supervised rooms, in the specific privacy of her own thoughts, which were the one territory Richard had never been able to reach and monitor and control. She told them about Richard's network, not the parts they already knew. She assumed correctly that the 3 sealed folders had covered the infrastructure, but the parts that existed beneath the infrastructure. The original purpose, the 30-year design. Richard had not built the network for money. He had built it for the dynasty's controlling provision, the Hargrove bloodline clause that Clara had inherited, and that Richard had believed, before Clara's birth, would come to him. A clause that, in the hands of its legitimate holder, gave absolute controlling authority over a financial trust so large and so deeply embedded in institutional infrastructure that its controller was, in practical terms, more powerful than most elected officials. Richard had spent 30 years trying to hold that clause, had murdered his own sister to get it, had discovered, in the immediate aftermath of Clara's death, that it had passed not to him, but to a daughter he had not known Clara was carrying. Had then spent 21 years trying to eliminate the daughter, not physically, because physical elimination created evidence, but through the systematic destruction of her credibility, her legal standing, her sense of self. Through Viven, through the network, through the falsified psychological records and the institutional corruption and the paid family silence. And when all of that had failed, when Elara had stood up from the marble floor and found Arthur, and found the briefcase, and found Marcus, Richard had deployed the Hargrove provision reversal, the legal instrument so obscure and so precisely targeted that Arthur had not prepared for it. "He can't win with it," Margaret said. "Not if my signature is authenticated." Clara knew that. She knew that the one thing Richard could never erase was a witness who had signed under a separate jurisdiction. That's why she asked me. That's why I signed. She reached into the coat she was wearing, a coat that was too large for her, borrowed, the coat of someone who had left a house in a hurry with the focused efficiency of a person who had been planning the leaving for a very long time, and produced an envelope. Small, cream-colored, sealed. "My original signature," she said, "notarized, with a chain of custody. Document that establishes its validity independent of any authentication Arthur's filing requires." She held it out. "Clara mailed it to me 22 years ago. One copy for the sealed filing, one copy for me. Richard has been looking for the second copy for 20 years. He never found it," Arthur said. "He searched everything I owned," Margaret said. 3 times, very thoroughly. A pause. "He never searched Daniel." Daniel reached into his jacket, produced an identical envelope, the secondary copy, the insurance, the document that Clara had sent to her mother 22 years ago with the specific foresight of a woman who understood that single points of failure were how careful plans were destroyed, and had therefore ensured that the most critical piece of her architecture had 2 physical locations. Arthur took both envelopes, opened his briefcase, worked with focused speed, assembling, organizing, completing the authentication chain that the evidence package had been waiting for, and within 11 minutes produced 3 complete filing packages, one for each jurisdiction, each one self-sufficient, each one carrying the full evidentiary weight of 22 years of careful preparation, plus Margaret's authenticated signature, plus the forensic chain of custody that made Dr. Adora's amended autopsy report not just admissible, but unassailable. He looked up. "On your word," he said to Elara. She looked at Marcus, at Daniel, at Margaret, at Clara's letter against her chest. "File," she said. Arthur sent 3 emails simultaneously. What followed happened in the compressed and relentless sequence of things that have been building for 30 years, and once released, do not pause for breath or drama, or the human need to process one thing before the next arrives. The governor's office was served at 2:14 in the morning, a jurisdictional filing that named him specifically, with financial documentation so precise and so thoroughly authenticated that his legal team, reached by phone at 2:17, advised him immediately and without ambiguity that there was no defense available that would survive the morning. He resigned at 2:41. His resignation triggered, automatically, a review mechanism in the state's judicial oversight body that immediately flagged 3 sitting judges whose names appeared in the registry, a mechanism that Arthur had quietly lobbied to have installed 4 years ago through a legal reform initiative that had appeared, to everyone involved in passing it, to be entirely unrelated to the Voss dynasty. Arthur had thought of everything. The financial records, the 20 years of payments from the Voss subsidiary accounts to the Hargrove family, to Vivian's network of corrupted officials, to the physician who had vanished after Clara's death and had been located by Marcus's investigative contact in a country without extradition 18 months ago, were filed with the Federal Financial Crimes Division at 302. The amended autopsy report, authenticated, chained, complete, was filed with the state's criminal investigation body at 317. With a simultaneous copy to the national outlet that had published Vivian's media strike, delivered through a source the outlet's editor trusted completely, with a note that explained, in precise and documented detail, that every claim in the published story was fabricated, and that the publication had 48 hours to retract before the fabrication itself became part of the legal record. The retraction was published at 4:51 in the morning. Richard's Hargrove provision reversal, the legal instrument he had been saving for 30 years, the mechanism so obscure that Arthur had not prepared for it, was countered at 5:08 with a jurisdictional filing that Margaret's authenticated signature made not merely contestable, but legally void. The jurisdiction in which Richard had filed had a specific and rarely invoked provision that rendered any challenge to a bloodline clause automatically dismissed in the presence of a living, authenticated witness. Margaret Hargrove was a living, authenticated witness. Margaret Hargrove was a living, authenticated witness. Richard's instrument, 30 years in reserve, deployed with the precision of a man who had never once been defeated, collapsed before the sun came up. At 6:23 in the morning, on a service road 80 miles north of the city, Elara's phone received a call from a number she did not recognize. She answered. "Miss Voss," said a voice she had never heard. Male. Older. The specific vocal register of institutional authority, a federal official, she would later learn, a member of the oversight body that had been triggered by the governor's resignation. "I am calling to inform you that a warrant has been issued for the arrest of Richard Hargrove on charges including conspiracy, financial fraud, and suspected complicity in the death of Elara Voss. Additionally, all legal challenges to your inheritance claim have been suspended pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. Your access to the Voss estate and associated accounts has been restored effective immediately." She listened to the full statement, said, "Thank you," ended the call, told the others. Marcus put his hand on her shoulder. Daniel looked at the highway with the expression of a young man who had spent his entire life at the periphery of a story and was processing, in real time, what it meant to finally be at its center. Arthur cleaned his glasses with the corner of his coat and said nothing because nothing was required. Margaret held Elara's hand. The meeting with Vivian happened 4 days later, not in a courtroom, not in the estate, in a visitation room in a facility that smelled of institutional cleaning products and the specific staleness of air that does not circulate freely. A room that Vivian occupied with the only dignity available to someone who had been stripped of every constructed dignity they had spent a lifetime assembling. She was still wearing gold jewelry. They had not taken that. She looked at Elara across the table with eyes that had been stripped of everything. The performance, the calculation, the thin smile, the architectural warmth. And what remained in them was something Elara had never seen from her before, and would spend a long time afterward trying to name. It was not remorse. It was not quite. It was the specific expression of a person who has arrived, through the total destruction of everything they built, at the truth of what they actually are beneath the building, and has found that truth to be smaller and more ordinary, and in its ordinariness, more devastating than the architecture they had constructed to conceal it. Vivienne had been a girl who was hungry, who had looked at the world from the outside for long enough that getting inside it had become the only organizing principle of her existence, who had loved Edmund, genuinely in her way, before the calculation had consumed the feeling, and had then loved the dynasty more, and had then loved the power of the dynasty most of all, and had made each of those substitutions so gradually that she had not noticed the person she had been at the beginning disappearing entirely. She had not started as a monster. She had built herself into one, step by step, choice by choice. Each decision slightly worse than the one before it, each compromise of her original self funded by the next acquisition, until the person who had once pressed her face against the glass of a world that excluded her had become the most terrifying thing inside it. "I want you to know," Viven said, "that I knew about Daniel." Elara looked at her. "Richard told me 3 years ago," Viven said. "He told me because he wanted me to understand the full scope of what I was protecting, what I had been protecting." She paused. "I did not tell anyone. I did not move against him. I told myself it was because I had no leverage, no proof, no mechanism to act. But that was not the reason." "What was the reason?" Elara asked. Viven held her gaze. "I was afraid," she said, "of Richard, of what he would do if I became a liability rather than an asset. I had seen what he did to liabilities." Another pause. The specific pause of someone who has decided to finish a truth they started. "I had seen what he did to Clara." The room was very quiet. "There is a safety deposit box," Viven said, "in a bank in the city. Box number 417. The key is in the lining of my right shoe." She looked down at her feet, then back at Elara. "Inside it is a recording, 3 years old. Richard explaining Daniel's existence to me in full. His voice, his words, his specific and detailed account of what was done to Clara, and why and who executed the physician's instructions." "Why are you giving me this?" Elara asked. Viven looked at her for a long moment, and the answer she gave was not the answer of a woman seeking legal consideration or reduced sentencing, or the mitigation of consequences she had fully earned. It was the answer of a woman who had arrived, at the very end of the road she had built for herself, at the one true thing she had left. "Because she deserved better," Viven said. "Clara deserved better, and you deserved better. And I knew that the entire time." She paused. "I did it anyway. Want you to know that I knew." Elara sat with that. Did not forgive it. Was not required to forgive it. But held it. The specific and terrible humanity of it. The ordinariness beneath the monstrousness. The girl who had been hungry looking out from behind the eyes of the woman who had destroyed her life. And understood that understanding something completely was not the same as accepting it, and that both things could be true simultaneously, without either one canceling the other. She stood. "The recording will be collected today," she said. She left without looking back. Richard Hargrove was arrested at 7:44 in the morning, on the day after the filings, at his primary estate, in the East Wing, 60 feet from the room where Margaret Hargrove had been living under his care for 15 years. He did not resist, did not make calls, did not deploy any of the institutional machinery that had protected him for 3 decades, because the machinery had been dismantled overnight with a precision and thoroughness that left nothing operational. He walked to the car with the specific stillness of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room for 30 years, and had just entered a room where that was no longer true, and had not yet, would perhaps never, built the internal architecture required to survive that transition. At the door of the car, he stopped, turned, looked at the woman standing at the entrance to his estate. Margaret Hargrove, 81 years old, in borrowed clothes, with Clara's eyes and the specific uprightness of a woman who had been waiting 15 years for this specific morning, looked back at her son without expression. "You should have known," she said, "that I would choose her." Richard got in the car. The car left. Margaret watched it go. The Voss estate was restored to Elara at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in November, the same month, a year later, that she had stopped on a cold pavement to help a limping stranger. She stood in the entrance hall in the noon light, the marble floors, the mahogany staircase, the chandelier above, and felt the house differently than she had felt it every other time she had stood in this specific spot. Different from the childhood version of standing here, small and instructed to be smaller. Different from the morning after the will reading, when the house had felt like a foreign object in her hands. Different even from the days of the briefcase and the folders and the world restructuring itself around her in real time. It felt like a house, just a house. A very large, very valuable, very historically significant house that had been built on the bones of something terrible, and was now, through the specific and hard-won alchemy of truth, deployed at the right moment in the right jurisdictions, being returned to the person it had always been meant for. She was not alone in it. Marcus was in the library, already there when she arrived, standing at the bookshelves with the expression of a man in a room that carries the resonance of someone he loved. Daniel was in the garden, examining the grounds with the curious attention of a young man encountering a piece of his own inheritance for the first time. Arthur was at the hall table, the same spot, with a cup of tea he had made himself, and a document he was reading with the quiet satisfaction of someone reviewing work that had been completed exactly as intended. Margaret was in the sitting room, in the chair closest to the window, looking out at the grounds with the particular expression of a woman returning to a place she had been removed from, and finding that the distance of 15 years had not diminished her relationship to it, but had simply deferred it, had held it in suspension, intact and waiting, for the morning she could reclaim it. Elara stood at the entrance hall window and looked out at the November light on the grounds and thought about Clara, about the 14 days before her birth in which her mother had built every door she would ever need, about the sealed will and the private investigator's report, and the legal instrument, and the letter, and the photograph, and the name on its back, about the specific and extraordinary intelligence of a woman who had understood, before her daughter existed, exactly what her daughter would need, and had built it all, and hidden it all, and trusted, with the particular faith of someone who sees people completely, that the right person would hold the doors open until the right moment. She reached into her jacket, took out the photograph. Clara's face looked up at her in the November light, warm, luminous, the smile of a woman in a moment of genuine happiness, preserved in the specific amber of a photograph that had been folded inside a shoe for 14 years. "Come home," the letter had said. She was home, but in a federal holding facility across the city. Richard Hargrove sat in a room that smelled of institutional cleaning products and made his first and only call to his legal team, and said 4 words. Words that his attorney immediately understood required the activation of a protocol that Richard had constructed 30 years ago and had never yet needed. A protocol that existed in the specific eventuality that every visible layer of his operation was dismantled, and he was left with only the deepest, the most invisible, the most carefully protected layer. The layer that nobody knew about. The layer that predated the network, predated the registry, predated the governor and Viven, and the corrupted officials, and every instrument he had deployed in 3 decades of operation. The layer that had been built not for power, but for survival. His attorney made 2 calls. The first was to a legal firm in a jurisdiction that had not appeared in any of Arthur's filings, any of the financial records, any of the documented intelligence that the 3 sealed folders and the real briefcase had contained, because this jurisdiction had been specifically and carefully excluded from every document Richard had ever allowed to be created. A jurisdiction where a specific and dormant legal instrument had been registered 25 years ago and had been sitting, patient and invisible, waiting for the day it was needed. The second call was to a person whose name had not appeared in the registry, whose name had not appeared in any document in Arthur's briefcase, in Margaret's testimony, in Vivien's recording, in the authenticated forensic chain, in any intelligence that had been gathered across 22 years of preparation. A person who was not in the country, who had not been in the country for 17 years, who answered the call on the first ring in a language that was not English, from a location that was not traceable through any commercial or governmental system that the people who had just dismantled Richard's visible empire had access to, who listened to Richard's attorney's summary without interruption, and then spoke. In English. 6 words. "I'll take care of the girl." End of Part 3. Richard's visible empire is gone. The governor has fallen. The network is dismantled. The corrupted officials face federal charges. Viven is confined. The dynasty is restored. But the layer beneath the layer, the 30-year survival protocol, the jurisdiction that appeared in no filing, the person 17 years out of the country whose name exists in no document, has just been activated. And the person on the other end of that call has never failed. Not once. In 30 years. Part 4 is not the continuation of a legal battle. Part 4 is a war without institutions, without courtrooms, without the protection of documented truth, because the person coming has spent 17 years specifically in the places where documented truth does not reach, and they are already moving toward the estate, toward the girl, toward the home that Clara built, and they know every door.